was actually being built in the 1930s and 40s in Detroit.
We were already researching American expertise in the 1930s Soviet Union, but we decided to take Fishman's point literally and explore the possibility of reverse technology transfer from the USSR back to the United States. Were developments around Detroit not merely evoking the image of Soviet linear city ideas, but actually informed by them? Without the intense pressure and rapid pace of the Soviet first five-year plan, would Detroit's architects and engineers have been able to upshift yet again to lay the foundations for an enhanced military-industrial complex between 1937 and approximately 1942? Our subsequent research suggests that on-the-ground participation in rapid Soviet industrialization in the late 1920s gave US industrialists experience in high-volume work that enabled them, a few years later, to embark on the largest war mobilization effort the world had ever seen in preparation for World War II. We found no later accounts of this reverse transfer from the USSR back to the US, but we found archival evidence from the 1930s and 40s. Our findings support the claim that the US armed its future Cold War foe with tank factories, and the USSR reciprocated by bolstering American technical skills. This is what we might call the infernal pas de deux of hegemonic powers visible through the evidence that can be found in the built environment and that is often suppressed in other places.
So I embarked upon this topic of US-USSR exchange during research for my book on early Soviet planning and architecture. So one of my primary sites is the Kharkiv tractor factory in eastern Ukraine that you're seeing here on the right, built in 1930. So Kharkiv should unfortunately be familiar to you as a target of destruction and the front line in the present Russian war of aggression. Soviet publications about this celebrated project from the early 1930s noted, very much to my surprise at the beginning of the research, that the industrial complex was modeled on the Stalingrad tractor factory that you see on the left, which had been designed whole cloth in Detroit, and that the construction site at Kharkiv was run in large part by American construction foremen. The nicest housing blocks in the concurrently built socialist city, which are still extant, remain referred to as the Amerikanki, or the American houses. Now, this information at first kind of threw me for a loop. And then sure enough, however, when I got my hands on the plans of each industrial complex, left again is Stalingrad, developed in Albert Kahn's Detroit office, and right a later Soviet plan for Kharkiv. And because I'm a trained architect and I do these sorts of things, I lined them up in AutoCAD and found that they matched, exactly down to the dimensions of the structural bays. One, however, was made of prefabricated steel, and then the other was a hybrid of steel and concrete. So this method of architectural adjustment, in this case, a kind of material constitution, actually has a very specific name in Russian. The term is привязка, or architectural adaptation. Now, corroborating evidence of this transnational multi-site industrial standardization campaign was nowhere found in later Soviet sources. The American contribution after the mid-1930s had been completely eradicated from the record. So this project, my first project, and then this much larger project with all of these colleagues asks what actually happened on these sites. What architectural history is revealed if we kind of pull back to see first, how were the business relationships established in this context of political ideological opposition? And then second, how the built environments in these far-flung places came to resemble, while not exactly replicating one another. So this keeps happening. Claire and I traveled together to Volgograd, former Stalingrad, in 2017, to explore one of these co-constructed sites. colleagues from the Volgograd State Technical University and Architecture School graciously served as our hosts, and we celebrate them in these photographs here. With their help, we gained access to remarkable original drawings like this one that you see on the left of the Stalingrad tractor factory's main gate, which imagines the factory and its residential settlement as the productive center of socialist life, rendered as a civic square constructed on the far side of the Ural Mountains. The architectural language, because there are many architects in here, so I think I should just mention that the language here of this aerial perspective from 1930 signals a transition from kind of modernist constructivism to a kind of neoclassical socialist realism in the Soviet Union. The functional factory buildings by Kahn and all are barely perceptible in the distance.
It was odd for us to go to Volgograd. The Kahn-built factory was reduced to rubble in the Battle of Stalingrad. It, or a similar installation, even appears at the beginning of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate as a nearly destroyed battleground site. But the point was to experience the factory and its famous linear urbanism, to see, walk around, and record the riverine site. It was not so easy, as it turned out, to see a Kahn-built factory grounds even. Sites like these are either A, owned by private entities who gain nothing from engaging foreign scholars, and this would be the complex in the previous slide, or B, are still considered sites of military industrial sensitivity. And in fact, this is still a tank factory. We couldn't penetrate deeply into the industrial site, although we could see the city, the famous Mamayev Kurgan memorial to the battle, and the housing that surrounded the site and was part and parcel of the urbanism of industry. With the help of our guides, we did meet the head of the now defunct Tractor Factory Museum. As sometimes happens in Russia, I am told, she received assurances from our host that we were harmless, sat us down, disappeared, then returned with plastic envelopes bursting with original construction photographs. Astonishing to us at the time, but subsequently quite logically, these images were nearly indistinguishable from some of the 85,000 construction photographs housed at the Bentley Historical Library in the Albert Kahn papers. We sat and snapped away. These iPhone photographs fill the pages of Detroit, Moscow, Detroit. We could get no others when it came time to publish. We enticed Jean-Louis, who was working on an exhibition about Americanism in Russian architecture, to join the conversation. We brainstormed a conference, applied for money, and from that point on, he was all in, from 2019 when we convened here in Ann Arbor. Here he is taking photos of the amazing Kahn Construction Administration album that is housed at the Bentley Historical Library, property of the Albert Kahn firm. The symposium held at the university in 2019 brought together most of our contributing authors, not only architectural historians, but Soviet and American historians, film and art historians.
A Russian colleague, Evgeniia Konysheva, traveled to the US for the first time for the conference. You can see her here on the upper right, presenting us with an absolutely stellar collection of Soviet-era aluminum pins from each of the tractor factories in the Urals. It's a truly prized possession. We've shared this kind of itinerary with you to underscore the book's long gestation period and the deeply collaborative nature of the effort from the beginning, which in the end, I think maps quite nicely onto the complex, transnational, collaborative story that emerges in these pages. So now, just some basic facts. Between 1929 and 1932, an office building in Moscow housed a team of American architects and engineers from Albert Kahn, Inc., who sat hip to hip in collaboration with their Soviet counterparts to generate over 500 industrial campuses in the USSR. Concurrently, a group of Soviet engineers and planners joined American colleagues for shorter stints in Detroit, Michigan, adapting components of the massive River Rouge plant for Avtozavod in Nizhny Novgorod. Now, although the US government did not recognize the USSR diplomatically until 1933, American private firms could engage in business with the Soviet government before that time, but at their own risk. The worldwide economic crash on October 29, 1929 was a boon to Soviet industrial planners needing foreign technical assistance to meet the government's stringent deadlines. The economies of some of the Soviets' biggest concessionaires in the pre-crash period, so Britain, Germany, the US, were in free fall. And this, imagine you can read this. So from 1929, the Soviet Union is, on an upward trajectory, and the capitalist countries are in free fall. And this left skilled firms like Kahn's or the Cleveland-based Austin Company in dire need of work. These firms had to be paid in dollars. The Russian ruble was not an international currency. And their brief cooperation ended in 1932 when the Soviets ran out of hard currency that had been wrung from their primary export, Ukrainian grain.
Yet the effects of this exchange continued to reverberate in both countries for decades afterward. Long after American industrial planners returned home, constructed environments in Soviet territories reflected their influence, while those same experts brought strategies they had learned building Soviet factories back to the United States. Given the choice, the Soviets favored American over European partners. As Adolf Joffe, director of the Chief Concessions Committee of the USSR, noted in 1927, the difference between Europe and America is that Europe must first sell us ready merchandise, make profits, and then invest in concessions, while America has liquid cash augmented by colossal energy and technical skill. The European offers are acceptable, but the American offers are preferred. The American model of capitalism was quick on its feet, flexible and liquid, ready for risk-taking, and assisted by the fact that large firms like Ford often controlled their own supply chain.
So the book itself is a collaboration, of course, not only between the three of us who we've been speaking up to this point, but also between 11 additional scholars whose research investigates the entanglement of Soviet and American built environments in this crucial period. So there are three thematic sections of the book that consider differing degrees of embeddedness, influence, and exchange of technical expertise between the US and the USSR in the period between 1917 and 1945, but really most intensely at the end of the 1920s and early 1930s. The authors of the highlighted chapters are here tonight, and you will hear from them shortly.
A photo essay precedes each section. One introduces industrial architecture in Detroit. The second offers a photographic comparison between the two contexts. The third covers sites in the Urals. The middle comparative section is perhaps the most compelling of the three. The architectural DNA, as it were, of these complexes is strikingly familiar from one site to the other. The precise location of each site pictured is often only discernible through small contextual clues, like a caption or a label. In this case, the same architectural firm, Albert Kahn Inc., is behind the designs. It's important to note at the outset that the local conditions on these sites precluded pure standardization. Topography, logistics, labor conditions all impacted the final constitution of the architectural projects in situ, and it was these complexities that led to the hiring of Kahn for this important set of contracts.
So back to this map. Now, the most extensive scholarship on foreign technical consultancies in the USSR is, in fact, a multi-volume work by the historian Anthony Sutton from the 1960s and 70s. And Sutton uses the phrase technical transfer rather than technical exchange to assert a unidirectionality of expertise from west to east. The Western contribution to Soviet production between 1917 and 1930 was total, he insisted. No important process has been isolated, which was not a west to east transfer. Now, this book's main theoretical intervention is our insistence that expertise was not merely transferred from the US to the USSR, but exchanged, and that the Soviet experience provided a blueprint, first for the New Deal's massive infrastructural scale and reach, and then for American industrial architectural production, heavily military, after 1937. So we argue that work experience in the USSR taxed and ultimately sharpened American technical consultants on the job resilience and inventiveness. Many of us here chose to focus our sole authored chapters in the book on this question of return, but not all. So what we'd like to do now is to introduce our fellow authors, and each of us will give you what we're hoping are very brief interviews. We've sort of given everyone strict instructions, 5 to 7 minutes apiece, but you'll get a nice kind of constellation of work. So our first author is Oksana Chabanyuk.
Oksana is a visiting scholar here at the University of Michigan from Kharkiv, from the architecture school at Kharkiv University, here in her second year at Ann Arbor, and a visitor in the year when we did the symposium. So Oksana has been a frequent visitor to us here.
Thank you so much, Claire. Okay. So in the beginning of my presentation, I would like, first of all, to express my gratitude to Professor Claire Zimmerman and Professor Christina Crawford for the invitation to participate in this project and to contribute to the book. I'm also very thankful to Fulbright program that supported me to do this research, and Weiser Center for European Eurasia for hosting me at the University of Michigan during 2019-2020 for this research. And also I'm grateful and thankful to Bentley Historical Library for consultations during my research. My chapter considers how the presence of the foreign specialists in the early Soviet period affected the built environment in Eastern Ukraine. As a foreign technical culture became part of the engineering and construction. The contribution of foreign specialists into industrial development in Eastern Ukraine from the 1920s to 1940s was concentrated in Kharkiv, the Donbas Basin, that is Donetsk, Makiivka, and Horlivka, and Dnipro-HES in Zaporizhia, Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk, Kryvyi Rih, Luhansk, and Kramatorsk. I'm focusing in my chapter specifically on the contribution of American specialist architects and engineers to develop of industry in the 1920s, 1930s in Kharkiv and Zaporizhia. One of the main obstacles for the understanding of foreign participation in the first 5-year plan in Eastern Ukraine is the fact that many Ukrainian archives were lost or transported between 1941 and 1945. Partially, the archival documents were removed from Ukrainian archives to Moscow and Leningrad during the Soviet era. Many archival documents pertaining to Ukrainian development projects remained in Moscow after the USSR collapsed. Moreover, Soviet-era publications deliberately obscured the facts and downplayed the participation of foreign specialists in the USSR's early industrialization. The current full-scale Russian war against Ukraine raises the specter that archival documents in the war-torn territories may be lost forever. For instance, the Kharkiv State Scientific Library by Korolenko, where I was starting my research and also continuing when I returned in 2020 to Kharkiv, was heavily targeted in March 2022. The chapter highlights several Eastern Ukrainian sites constructed during the first 5-year plan, the Kharkiv tractor plant and Dnipro-HES in Zaporizhia, and also HEMS plant in Kharkiv. Archival closed documents as this one, maybe you can go to another slide. Yes, thank you. Archival closed documents, as this one on the slide describes the participation of foreign specialists involved in the construction of Kharkiv tractor plant. Leon Svajan was among them. He was originally from Albert Kahn's office. Svajan was head of the construction department in Kharkiv tractor construction, previously participating in the construction of the Stalingrad tractor plant that was designed by Albert Kahn. Leon Svajan was highly estimated by Tractor Stroy, that's the organization that was in charge of the construction, from colleagues there as an engineer responsible for difficult and complex work during the construction of KTZ, Kharkiv tractor plant. The foreign specialists were typically heads or vice heads of departments. An engineer or group of engineers from Kharkiv would be assigned to these foreign specialists. In 1930s, Morris Kahn and 25 American architects and engineers came to State Design Construction Institute in Moscow, a design institute that was tasked to absorb American experience and spread it among construction organizations. The institute became a huge architectural office and with 1,000 employees in all of its branches, including those in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, Kyiv, Dnipro, and Odessa. Albert Kahn stated in one of his letters in 1930s to the administration of the Soviet Union that effective cooperation with this State Design Institute was not achieved. Here are some reasons for that. There were not enough highly qualified Soviet architects and engineers at that time. American architects had to do most of the drawings by themselves. They had to draw instead of managing the departments at the institute. During 3 years of work by Albert Kahn and Hosprojekt Stroy 1, this is the institute, Design Institute in Moscow, more than 500 industrial objects that, as Christina mentioned, were designed. Eastern Ukrainian factories among them as Kharkiv tractor plant, machinery building plant in Kramatorsk. American specialists quickly implemented design unification and standardization into the Soviet practice of industrial plant design. Soviet engineers traveled to the US in the early 1930s to gain experience to be used on projects in the USSR. Rare archival documents confirm these facts. For instance, the reports which I was studying were covering the working trips of the Soviet engineers, which were observing the equipment produced by Siemens, General Electric Company, and suppliers of the Ford plant. This chapter also considers foreign assistance at Dnipro-HES and other Ukrainian sites. For instance, the New York-based design and construction firm Stewart James and Company had to develop designs of the mines and construction drawings, manage the construction projects for Donvogilya, it's Donetsk coal, that the headquarters or the office was situated in Kharkiv. And the Stewart James and Company opened a design office in Kharkiv with its specialists. Or the main technical consultant in the construction project in Dnipro-HES, the hydropower station on the Dnipro River in Zaporizhia, was Colonel Hugh Cooper of the New York-based Cooper and Company. General Electric was also involved in the technical assistance of Dnipro-HES in Zaporizhia during its construction. Many North American specialists and engineers were involved in the construction of Dnipro-HES. They lived in the building for the foreign consultants that was especially designed and constructed in the socialist city in Zaporizhia and in the so-called American village in Zaporizhia. So some of them were coming with families and were living in this village. The international General Electric engineers and the Soviet technicians designed an architectural and engineer project for the construction of the Hems turbine works That's the plant in Kharkiv. They were designing it in Schenectady office in New York. For the conclusion, the forgotten history of foreign specialists in Eastern Ukraine has left a significant gap in our knowledge about how industrialization unfolded there during the first 5-year plan. The chapter seeks to deepen research based on archival documentation to investigate accurate history of early Soviet industrialization. And what I would also add in addition to this published book, that this is the research that I would see would be very valuable to translate to Ukrainian language and to publish in Ukraine in order to disseminate true history of early Soviet industrialization, industrial construction. Thank you.
We'll now try to spotlight our first remote speaker, who's Professor Robert Fishman, Professor Emeritus from Taubman College. Do I need to quit out of this? So we can see Robert.
Okay, thank
Hold on,
you.
Robert. Hold on, we're just trying to get to see you a little bit.
Okay, well, it's not entirely necessary in my view, but so okay.
Okay, go ahead, Robert.
Okay, very good. And yeah, thank you, Claire and Christina, and of course the late Jean-Louis Cohen for a remarkable opportunity for me to explore the meaning of 20th century Detroit from a very new perspective. Now, the basic thesis of my chapter is if Moscow was the capital of the self-proclaimed workers' state, Detroit was the capital of the international workers' movement. And by workers' movement, I mean workers' self-organization. And in that context, nothing in labor history before or since can match the scale and intensity of the industrial unionization movement in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s, a movement centered on America's industry of industries, the automobile industry, which of course means centered on the Motor City itself. Through a series of hard-fought strikes led by the United Auto Workers, starting from the Flint sit-down strike of 1936 to 1937, the United Auto Workers, the UAW, achieved or started to achieve what the economist John Kenneth Galbraith called countervailing power to the top-down power of American capitalism. And I would say that the wage settlements that came out of these strikes, especially the so-called Treaty of Detroit in 1950 between General Motors and the United Auto Workers, these created a template, I would say, for an industrial society where workers were guaranteed their fair share of the wealth generated by increased productivity. So in all of these ways, as I say, Detroit was the real capital of the international workers' movement. Though I think the irony of this particular episode is that the union organizers in the UAW were mostly socialists or even communists, but their victories helped to create the strongest form of capitalism that the world had ever seen. What we call in English social democracy, what the French call les 30 glorieuses, those 30 years between 1945 and 1975, when the industrial working class in the West was finally integrated into the fabric of an advanced industrial society. All of this, I think, comes out of the unique experience of Detroit and Southeast Michigan in those critical years of the 1930s and 1940s. Now, going back to the famous sit-down strike in Flint, 1936 to 1937, where automobile workers first won the right to organize and to be recognized. It was a true David versus Goliath fight. You know, the Flint local, a handful of members, hardly $200 in their treasury when the strike began, versus the largest industrial corporation that the world had ever seen. And yet they won, and I think took history in a very different direction. And I would say there were three key advantages, kind of hidden advantages, that the UAW and the workers' movement had. And that is that, first of all, General Motors and the other big automobile manufacturers had, to some degree, done the work of organizing for the UAW by concentrating workers in huge assembly plants, by grouping these assembly plants in predominantly in Southeast Michigan. They created the spatial context for Detroit as this capital of the workers' movement. And secondly, the unions were able to galvanize the wider working class, first of all, by organizing everyone working in a factory into one big union rather than the division where only a few skilled workers were organized, organizing everyone, and that this revolutionary tactic, the sit-down strike, which not only took over the factories, but created a situation where the communities around the factories could become crucial in making sure that the men occupying the factories themselves could continue their strike to victory. So these, as I say, were the three sort of hidden advantage. That was two, and then the third one was the workers understood the production process better than management. They realized that General Motors' production process created a handful of key factories, many of which were located in Flint or in Detroit, that were, that essentially controlled the production process for the whole corporation. And if you could concentrate on those factories and take them over through the sit-down strikes, you win the strike. And that is exactly what happened. And those of us who followed, I hope all of us followed the UAW strike, and just recently in the fall of 2023, where it seemed like absolute madness for a weakened union to take on General Motors, Ford, and the company formerly known as Chrysler, Stellantis, all at once. But they did it by concentrating on a handful of key factories for these three, and forcing the companies back to the bargaining table. But let me just conclude with return to the period of the book. As someone who didn't, who learned so much about this technological exchange that Christina mentioned. I mean, I was surprised, frankly, at how successful the Soviet Union was in assimilating the mass production techniques that they learned from Ford, Kahn, and others. A success, of course, of world historical significance in World War II. But I would say, based on this thesis, there was one aspect of this technological exchange that essentially Soviet communism could not assimilate, could not import, could never endure. And that was a strong independent workers' movement. That, of course, was the heritage to the West coming out of these years. Thank you.
Our next speaker is coming to us from San Francisco, independent scholar Sonia Melnikova-Raich, who is also the great niece of Saul Braun, one of the partners of the Kahn organization in the Soviet Union. Can we see Sonia?
Yes, sure. Hello. Hello, everybody. First of all, of course, I would like to thank Claire and Christina for inviting me to contribute to this book and to say just a few words about how I first almost met Jean-Louis Cohen. It was in the late 1970s. I worked at an architectural bureau in Moscow that shared the building with the Museum of Architectural History, where at the same time, a young French art historian was working on his research for the major exhibit, Moscow, Paris, which in 1981 was simultaneously opened in the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow and the Pompidou Center in Paris. We might have passed by each other many times in the courtyard, but we never had a chance to talk to each other until exactly 40 years later, when a famed architectural historian, Jean-Louis Cohen, visited me in San Francisco and immediately noticed the heavy 2-volume catalog of that Moscow Paris exhibit on my bookshelf. It was one of only a few of my favorite art books that I brought with me when I emigrated from the Soviet Union in 1986. Not surprisingly, it was such a great honor for me to work with Jean-Louis for this project, and such a great sadness as for all of us to lose him. My chapter in this book is called Whence Did It All Come? 2 Contracts, Girls in Socks, and the Great Turning Point. It is a kind of sequel to my earlier 2-part article, The Soviet Problem with 2 Unknowns, how an American architect and a Soviet negotiator jump-started the industrialization of Russia, published in Industrial Archaeology in 2010 and 11. At that time, those 2 unknowns, Albert Kahn and Saul Braun, indeed were mostly unknown. Their role in the industrialization of Russia was mostly unknown. And those first 2 parts mainly focused on the role played by Kahn and Braun, at the time the chairman of the Soviet trade agency Amtorg in New York, in laying the foundation of the Soviet automobile, tractor, and tank industry, which led to the development of Soviet defense capabilities prior to World War II, which in turn played an important role in the Allies' defeat of Nazi Germany in that war. The new chapter illustrates how, in addition to playing this historic role on the global scale, Kahn's principles of architectural design formed the basis of the Soviet School of Standardization in Industrial Design and Construction, and how his assembly line design process became a universal working method in most of Soviet architectural organizations. This method, termed at the time as Russo-Amerikanskaya Sistema, Russian-American system, was developed during 1929 through 1932 through collaboration between Soviet and American engineers working at Kahn's office in Detroit and the Soviet Design and Construction Trust Госпроектстрой in Moscow, which opened in the spring of 1930 following Kahn's signing of his seminal agreement with Sol Bromo-Vantorg on behalf of the Soviet government, which made his firm the consulting architects for practically all Soviet industrial construction under Stalin's 5-year plan. While my original research heavily relied on archival documents from Russian and American archives, the work and life of American specialists in Moscow and Soviet specialists in Detroit in this chapter is presented mostly through the eyes of several witnesses and participants. Albert Kahn's brother Moritz, who oversaw the work in the USSR, and his wife Edith, Kahn's chief engineer George Skringer, who headed Госпроектстрой, Joseph French, who was one of about 40 Kahn's architects delegated to Moscow, a Soviet architect, Andrei Burov, who spent several months in Detroit studying the design process at Kahn's office, and Elizar Gurevich, a Soviet engineer who headed 40 Soviet designers who came to Detroit to work at the Tractor Engineering Bureau they set in the Union Trust building at 500 Griswold Street in Detroit to design the first Soviet Caterpillar tractor to be produced at the gigantic tractor factory in Chelyabinsk that was being designed just around the corner at Kahn's office at Marquette Building at West Congress Street. And so here we have on the left, it took me lots of sloving to locate the location of actual building in Moscow and the contemporary photograph of the building where Albert Kahn's specialist worked at Госпроектстрой. And this was actually a vacant warehouse at the time of an old textile factory nationalized after the revolution. And here, unfortunately, we have this block that you mentioned, yeah, covering this wonderful photograph. Here is this is a photograph of Joseph French. Oh, this is much better. Thank you, Joseph French. As I mentioned, one of Kahn's architect who was delegated to Moscow, and these three photographs were kindly shared with me by his grandson. And these two photographs are taken by Joseph French. This one is interior of this building on the left of Госпроектстрой. And in description by Moritz Kahn, he described it that it was so packed that for somebody to get out of their working table to leave the room, they would have to ask everybody else get up to get through. And I was so pleased when I discovered this photograph. It correlated, so it's totally corroborated, that description by Moritz Kahn. And below is a photograph of Albert Kahn with this group of his specialists in Moscow during his visit in 1931. Kind of very sweet photograph. They're all cramped in one of the apartments occupied by American specialists. And on this other slide, yes, this slide, this is similarly, this is a photograph of Elizar Gurevich, that Soviet engineer who came with, interestingly enough, also 40 Soviet specialists working at that tractor design bureau in Detroit. These photographs were shared with me by Elizar Gurevich's son. This little portrait, one of very few portraits of his of that time, is actually from his passport the Soviet authorities issued to him for his trip to the United States. And I think at this point, I would like to add, even on a sad note, that sadly, later when these people, after the incredible input into Soviet industrial development, when Meerovich returned to the Soviet Union, later during Stalin purges, he was arrested and killed. And practically everybody who was associated with the work in Detroit during that time suffered one way or another from Stalin's repressions. So this is, in short, I think the chapter makes interesting reading because it's really through the eyes of the people who were there. So if you have any questions, perhaps in the end, we will have some time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Louis, next we have Louis Siegelbaum from Michigan State University, Professor Emeritus, and author of the marvelous website, 17 Moments in Soviet History. Louis, can you see us all? Yeah.
I can now see myself.
Well, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, both Claire and Christina, for putting up with my desperate last-minute questions about how I log on and, in response to some messages such as help. So thank you for making it possible for me to be here. When Claire invited me to participate in this conference, the conference on which the book is based, I already had retired. But like Claire, I was still living in Michigan as an emeritus professor. I now live in Pasadena, California. 10 years earlier, I had published a book on the history of the Soviet automobile called Cars for Comrades. And although I had gone on to other things, I retained a keen interest in the subject. That interest extended to some of the key individuals in the story I told in that car book, none more so than Valerian Osinsky, shown here on the left-hand side of the screen. Before telling you about a little bit about Osinsky, I want to say that although coming in the twilight of my career, my participation in this project was a brand new experience in two ways. First, it was the first time that I had dwelt among architectural and art historians, having been a labor historian, then an historian of consumption and material culture, and then eventually an historian of migration. It was something of a revelation to me to see what could be done with PowerPoint slides, to say nothing of interpretations of the built environment. Second, anchoring my presentation and the chapter that eventuated from it around Osinsky, and much like Richard Anderson did in the next chapter about Andrei Burov, this represented the first time I had ever engaged in biography as a mode of historical inquiry. I found these two new experiences alternately intimidating and exhilarating. So who was Osinsky and what did he do? Although many leading Bolsheviks hailed from non-proletarian backgrounds, Osinsky, whose real surname was Obolensky, was possibly unique in descending from one of the aristocratic, so-called boyar families of Russia. Briefly, head of the state bank and chair of the Supreme Council of the National Economy after the October Revolution, he resigned from those positions after throwing in his lot with the left communist faction that opposed ending hostilities against Imperial Germany. During the winter of 1925-26, Osinski toured the United States to study the country's agricultural systems. But after visits to New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and the Ford plants at Highland Park and River Rouge, he became convinced that if Russia was to overcome its proverbial backwardness, it had to have its own automobile industry. From that moment on, Osinski played the key role in promoting automobile manufacturing and road construction in the Soviet Union by promoting Americanism. He graphically made his case in the American automobile or the Russian cart. Could we have the second slide, please? Yeah, so the design for which appears, the cover design for which appears on the right-hand side of the screen. This was a collection of articles he originally had published in Pravda. While America, as of 1927, had more than 23 million cars, the USSR had 12,000. Fewer, Osinski noted, than 19 European countries, fewer even than China. Osinski was also instrumental in negotiating contracts with Albert Kahn's firm to build prototype plants in Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod, and with Ford to provide the technology to build the largest auto plant in Europe, the State Automobile Factory, GAZ, located in Nizhny Novgorod. But as he repeatedly emphasized, cars without roads were useless. And so road construction became his other passion. He popularized the case for road construction in several ways. He founded and served as the first president of the voluntary Society for the Development of Automobilism and Road Improvement, whose acronym was Avtodor. He also served as chief editor of that society's journal, Za Rulyom, Behind the Wheel. It was a monthly that 96 years later is still being published, now with 320,000 subscribers. And he went on excursions, such as the 2,000-kilometer trip from Moscow to Kharkiv and back in July 1929 to publicize the abominable condition of the roads and the misadventures they caused. The Soviet Union didn't exactly advance on the direct path to socialism in a speedy automobile, as Osinski put it, nor did it fix the damn roads, as Gretchen Whitmer's slogan from another place and era urged. It did expand automobile production in the 1930s, albeit not at the pace that Osinski's slogan of every worker and peasant sitting in a car envisioned. It also saw the construction of some major highways connecting Moscow to Kiev and Minsk. The problem, I argue, is not that Osinski's dreams were utopian. All dreams are utopian, and utopias are never realized. The catch was that Osinski's American-inspired automobilism depended on labor techniques that either reproduced capitalist exploitation or harkened back to pre-capitalist times. Like Ford's factories, Soviet auto plants installed assembly lines in which workers were expected to toil under a strict Taylorist-inspired regimen. As for road construction and maintenance, a law of 1928 required so-called labor participation, unquote, amounting to 6 days per year for all able-bodied adults residing in the countryside, a form of corvée labor, in Russian barshchina, that serfs were obligated to perform before their emancipation in 1861. And as far as highway construction was concerned, well, the NKVD saw to it that the incarcerated, so-called zeks, redeemed themselves through their labor. But to return to the biographical and to conclude, upon his return from a second tour of the US in 1935, nearly 10 years after his first trip, Osinski wrote in Pravda that, quote, the sword of Damocles hangs over the whole nation, unquote. Neither he nor others who so faithfully served the cause of Soviet industrialization could imagine that the sword of Stalinist state violence hung over them. Yet 2 years later, during what is typically known as the Great Terror, that sword fell on Osinski himself. He was executed at the age of 51. Thank you.
And we have our last virtual visitor. Thank you, Louis, so much. Thank you for that. Our last chapter author is Mariah Taylor, assistant professor at Cornell University. Mariah, are you there?
I am.
I think
there we go.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you. It's been a joy and a pleasure to be part of this whole project, although Jean-Louis is definitely missed. So this is part of a larger project of mine on Soviet urban greening and environmentality, and specifically this idea of a garden factory as a model that was followed. So the greening of an industrial district with flowers and trees might initially appear banal or trivial in the context of Stalinist violence, but there was more to it than beautification. As I argue in this chapter, Stalin-era approaches to the problem of city-factory relations emerged from the rejection of Americanism and foreign specialists in the early 1930s. By the 1950s, urban greening became a fundamental infrastructure of Soviet urbanism, managed concurrently with the better-known technogenic systems. In the long term, the ambitions of urban greening influenced the distinctive development of Soviet urban form and state-society relations, proving both durable and consequential for Soviet cities and city dwellers. The question of how to design for industry was undeniably central to the Soviet project. How and why did interest in green city urbanism and skylarks for workers, an early topic of conversation in letters between Le Corbusier and Moise Ginsburg, how did these ideas persist after 1932 among Soviet architects and urban planners? Among those tasked with factory reconstruction was Ivan Sergeyevich Nikolaev, a youthful constructivist and later a leading figure in industrial architecture. Using Nikolaev and his biography as a lens for this history provides perspective at scales relevant to the duration and distribution of these projects. As Nikolaev asserted at a 1950 conference of the Union of Soviet Architects leadership, quote, the question of a mutual relationship between factories and cities is an existential question for the whole urban population of our country, for the successful work of our socialist industry, unquote. Greenery ultimately played a significant part in Soviet architects' efforts to solve the question of city-factory relations. I find that Soviet specialists turned to landscape interventions as they navigated the dilemma of designing industrial facilities that were simultaneously modern and visibly socialist. In this chapter, I focus on the reconstruction of major factories, beginning with the second five-year plan, so 1933 to 1937, and then what happens after that. Sites reconstructed included the Stalingrad and Chelyabinsk tractor factories, the Gorky automobile factory, and numerous others, such as this in Sverdlovsk. Not incidentally, many were the product of American industrial and engineering expertise, for example, by Albert Kahn and his firm and the Austin Company. The reconstruction of these giants was ideological and professionally urgent, given the simultaneous imperatives of industrial modernization and differentiation from capitalist and imperial counterparts. These factories' transnational origins were easily obscured in official Soviet architectural discourse. On the ground, the material legacy of Americanism and formalism proved more challenging to camouflage, even as the need to do so grew increasingly existential amid the violence of the Stalin period. Can you go to the next one? So eventually, writing in an assessment of the Stalingrad tractor plant and other mid-1930s reconstruction projects, Ivan Nikolaev argued for an approach where greenery and trees were integral to the city factory ensemble. Quote, "For the harmonious resolution of industry-city relations, it is necessary above all to eradicate the vestiges of capitalist antagonism between factory and housing. Soviet planning for industrial hazard mitigation at this time relied heavily on sanitary protective zones of 2 kilometers, 250 meters, and 50 meters located between industrial and residential areas, according to 3 classes of hazard." So in this image, you see how they were designing both a boulevard that is supposed to go around the Stalingrad tractor plant and different classes of hazard and the spatial buffers that would protect those areas on the right. To this day, oversized industrial sites are considered iconic expressions of state socialist political economies. Considerable professional intent and standardization contributed to those sites' characteristic size, layout, and location within Soviet cities, as I show in my chapter. Landscape interventions provided both the mechanism and marker of building socialism, a means of mitigating the mental and physical health hazards of Stalinist industrialization, and perhaps some measure of protection from political attack. As the chief of greening at the Kaliber factory in Moscow, Ivan Usov declared in support of greening's continuance into the post-Stalin era, "At a socialist factory, greenery is not an excess, but a most authentic productive necessity, a beautiful means of labor protection. A garden is the lungs of a factory. A garden is a jolt of vivacity for the full working day." Often, industrial modernity is treated as a technogenic space in which nature is absent or diminished, even as recent studies and design interventions at Fortis sites, from the River Rouge plant to Detroit as a whole, have foregrounded the significance of landscape to industry. In Moscow and other centers of Soviet industrialization, as this chapter shows, industrial greening comprised an attractive bundle of professional, pragmatic, and political benefits. The sheer multifunctional nature of greening's ambitions ensured its durable influence on Soviet urbanism, rooted in the complex legacy of exchange and rupture between Moscow and Detroit.
Thank you, Mariah. So we are pretty much over time here. What that means, I think, is that if you'd like to know about our chapters, you'll have to read the book because we can't really do any more. We can't hold you any longer. We want to get your questions and comments. Yeah, and I would say that our chapters are in a very nice relationship to each other. Christina's chapter is a very broad historical analysis of the return, and my chapter is kind of deep dive into the experience of the Kahn firm and the results of their of returning to Detroit after the end of the plan. So those I think await you. Meanwhile, are there comments or questions? We can take comments from the Zoom space. If you don't want to put your comment in the chat, please raise your hand. And Austin, who has assisted us so ably, thank you, Austin, so much. We'll bring you up and you can speak to us. And if you're comfortable putting the question into the chat, we can access the questions from the chat. And you can ask any of us, anybody in the Zoom room or anybody here, to answer questions about what we just presented. Madeline.
Yes.
Can you hear Robert?
Robert?
Maybe we
Okay, maybe someone else should.
They can hear Yeah, can we stop sharing the screen?
There it is. Robert, can you hear everybody?
He's gotta take himself off. He's not muted.
You're
Oh,
muted.
You're muted.
Claire and
Professor.
Christina, we could hear you very clearly, but we can't hear the
Oh.
audio question.
Okay,
How
can you
about
hear
now?
me now with the mic?
Yes, okay, thank you, Mark.
Mariah. Professor Fishman, I have a question for you, and what you make of the fact that many graduate student locals are now in the UAW, and sort of how that might help us reflect back upon the stand up and sit down strike.
Yeah, I mean, I myself was amazed that the UAW now has 377,000 members, down from about 1,500,000 at its peak in the 1970s. Of those 377,000, almost 100,000 are in higher education. I mean, think about that for a minute. And I mean, it seems clear that the UAW president, Sean Fain, would not have been elected without the votes of the higher education contingent of the UAW. He then went on to lead the most successful strike that perhaps any any major union has undertaken out of the last decade, that points towards a remarkable recovery, I hope, of the labor movement. So I think that as I say, the UAW is not what it used to be, and that could be a very good thing for the next era of social democracy.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry.
I'm not sure. Do I have to use this?
I'm afraid
So they can
so.
hear you in the Zoom space.
Hi, my name's Steve. I'm not sure. I can't remember which speaker author mentioned mass production in terms of Albert Kahn and consulting on mass production, but it brought up the question in my mind: to what degree did Albert Kahn Associates work on mass production per se? Was Bill Knudsen from Ford involved in any of the Soviet projects in terms of placing mass production within the Albert Kahn factories, consulting with Albert Kahn Associates? I don't know if Knudsen had already moved over to Chevrolet or not when the first 5-year plan was happening. So does anyone know anything about cooperation with the U.S. automakers, Ford, or perhaps General Motors, perhaps William Knudsen specifically, in terms of implementing mass production in Kahn factories?
So some of us may be able to speak to that. I think what we know about the collaborations was that the Kahn group worked very closely with at least in the case of Ford, with the Ford plant engineers to do the layouts. And so of the two main planning documents that were used for these kinds of complexes, there's the process schedule and the routine diagram. And the process schedule would be in the hands of, I think, of the plant engineer, and the routine diagram would be something where the architect could enter into essentially spatializing the process schedule on the floor plan of the building. But these were collaborations between the engineers and architects who worked for the auto companies and the Kahn group. Some sources say that Kahn just designed the envelope and the plant engineers did all the internal layouts, and others claim a greater role for the Kahn engineers and architects in that process. And it probably varied from site to site. Ford might have been slightly different from the other automakers in keeping a much tighter control over the design of the layouts of factories, because they were tight in the Ford plants. Does anybody else want to chime in here on this?
I mean, the one thing I would say, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, so I don't want to say that I've seen this in the archive, but there is a sort of general understanding that the Americans weren't entirely sure what was going to be going on and what was to be made in some of these factories. So the hyper thick foundations, for instance, that you would need to build tanks rather than tractors, right? So the foundations were thicker than you would need for tractors, and so there was sort of an intuition that perhaps these might in fact be for different types of machines. But I mean, Oksana, you may know more about this.
Alan is the person to speak to the first question. Alan Cobb of
I'm sorry, I have to say something in that there was a very strong collaboration and relationship, of course, between Albert Kahn and the architects, French and others, and the Ford and GM and Chrysler folks. And so it's a collaboration, but Kahn's aim really in designing these buildings was to make them infinitely flexible. They're universal space. The process changes, you know, from year to year to year. They're always retooling. They're always creating a different way of developing an assembly line and the products that come off it. So the building has to be extremely flexible, and that's what Kahn was so good at.
And may I just add that, of course, during the Second World War, the gauze plant in Nizhny Novgorod quite quickly converted to tank production. As an example of what you were referring to a moment ago. And I would also add that as far as assembly line production was concerned, there were American workers there to assist as well. The Ruther brothers, Walter and Victor, went to work in the gauze plant for about 18 months to train Soviet workers based on their own experience at Ford.
I would just add there's a chapter in the book that goes into by Christina Kiaer about a film about an American auto worker who goes to the Soviet Union and experiences anti-racism, contrary to what he had experienced in the United States. This Russian film, the Soviet film, makes the point that in Russia, in the Soviet Union, there was no racism against African Americans. So that's also an interesting chapter.
Yeah, the worker being African American.
Yeah, the worker was African American. Yeah,
right.
Yindrik first, and then Dale.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question about this reverse movement that you indicated at the beginning from the Soviet Union to the U.S. What was it actually? Is there any kind of
so that is our two chapters. And we had intended to we were a little optimistic in our timing for tonight.
Right, so I'm on the right address, so thank you.
You're on the right track. Yeah. So I think Dale had, and Sonia, did you want to chime in here?
She's muted. Unmute.
Yes. I just wanted to go into two previous questions to emphasize that the Ford's mass production and conveyor style work at his plants, and Albert was one of the main reasons of Soviets narrowing down to Albert Kahn and choosing him for this collaboration was because he was considered the main architect of Ford's plants, especially in Rouge. And it certainly totally changed the design process and all the production processes on the factories were built after Ford's model. And in those years, the word Fordism, Fordization, it's amazing how capitalism was done, but Ford was a hero. And so definitely the model was Ford for all of that. And in regard to whether it was mentioned I think, Christina, you mentioned this whole thing about heavy foundations. It's really very interesting. There was kind of a little ambiguity back when I first started researching the subject, how much Albert Kahn actually knew that his designs in the Soviet Union, the factories, are going to be dual use for a civil and defense production. It was not quite obvious, even though he indicated this whole thing about these foundations that were designed way too heavy for production of tractors and quite appropriate for tanks. But when I read the letters from Joseph French, it became unequivocal because he wrote in his letters at that time that they were totally aware of this dual use of the of the factories that they designed, of possible dual use, because it was still early 30s.
Dale.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into my question, because in my studies of Albert Kahn, I have never really come across a lot of evidence that the United States government attempted to exert any level of control over the Kahn company's dealings with the Soviet Union. And that strikes me as really odd because, you know, governments tend to get their fingers into everything. And it was fairly obvious to everyone involved at that point that there was going to be a dual use and that some of these factories would likely be transformed to military production at some point. And I'm just wondering if any of the scholars involved in the conversation have ever come across evidence of the U.S. government attempting to exert some sort of control over Kahn's dealings overseas. Because to me, it's kind of slightly flabbergasting that there is no evidence of that.
We didn't find any that I know of. I mean, maybe Louis has something to offer here. We did
Sonia
not,
raised her arm.
and Sonia may as well. Yeah, I mean, we found very little evidence of that. We did find the evidence on the back end of the U.S. government being concerned about the people, some of the workers who came back. Yeah, redacted FBI files, things like that. But that was, you know, later. I mean, I think the overall point I would make here is that the opposition between the Soviet Union and the United States was not fully developed at this point in time. That's really a post-war formation, and it's really the reason we did this book is that it's only after World War II that you get this kind of closing off on both sides of the idea of there ever being a shared exchange of technology between the two.
And I mean, just one other point that I get into in my chapter that became really fascinating to me was the degree to which Americans of all political stripes were in the midst of the Great Depression and the buildup of the New Deal, looking very closely at the first 5-year plan as a successful enterprise. And so this, like, our understanding of Cold War opposition, it wasn't yet fully formed, I guess I would say. And the first 5-year plan, there was a lot of American interest in the first 5-year plan as a potential model for the New Deal.
I think in 29, the U.S. government had its hands full trying to figure out.
There were other things. Yeah, there were other things going on.
Did you want to add something to that?
Well, yeah. What's interesting is that when in regard of the role of the government, I didn't see any traces of pressure to Kahn's company. On contrary, at that time, American government, in the absence of diplomatic relations, wanted to dissociate itself from all the Americans working in the Soviet Union, and always announced that everybody who wants to go to work in the Soviet Union should do it on their own risk. And on the other hand, when they debriefed American workers returning to United States, when they debriefed them in consulate in Riga, because there was no embassy or consulate in Moscow, there was only in the neighboring Riga, was an independent country of Latvia. When they debriefed them, it's so obvious that they were mostly interested in any possibility of communist propaganda being carried back to America by these American workers. They were not even interested in possibility of espionage, or least of all, messing with the company's business in Russia. They were absolutely obsessed only with communist propaganda. Even with Amtorg being, of course, involved later in some espionage activities. At that time, nobody was interested in that, only in possibility that Amtorg would disseminate communist propaganda. And I did not see any traces of trying to influence Americans' work in Russia, in the Soviet Union at that
Thank
time.
you all. I'd say, and thank you for those who put comments in the chat. Kirk, I would say, take a look at the book. And then stay tuned for my book about Albert Kahn, which will go into detail on industrial architectural design and its interplay with structural engineering. Thank you all. It's 8:30. We've gone on too much time already, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm not